Chapter 15, Resolution, in which the Grasshopper solves all of the riddles by outlining a picture of utopia. Grasshopper. The solution of the riddle has three chief elements. They are 1. Play, as we have stipulatively used that term to designate any intrinsically valuable activity. 2. Game playing, as I have defined it. And 3. What I should like to call the ideal of existence. By the ideal of existence, I mean that thing or those things whose only justification is that, well, they justify everything else. Or, as Aristotle put it, those things for the sake of which we do other things, but which are not themselves done for the sake of anything else. Now, I believe that the two of you have assumed I am making the claim, a claim which is, I agree, prima facie plausible, that play is identical with the ideal of existence. But the position I shall attempt to establish requires a modification or interpretation of that claim. This position can be expressed by two related contentions. The first is that play is necessary but not sufficient adequately to account for the ideal of existence. The second is that game playing performs a crucial role in delineating that ideal, a role which cannot be performed by any other activity, and without which an account of the ideal is either incomplete or impossible. In order to support these contentions, I would like to use the kind of device Plato used in trying to get at certain characteristics of the human psyche. If we look at the state, said Plato, we will find there the magnified extensions of the characteristics of the psyche that we are seeking, and, being magnified, they will be easier to recognize. Somewhat similarly, I would like to begin by representing the ideal of existence as though it were already instituted as a social reality. We will then be able to talk about a utopia which embodies that ideal, that is, a state of affairs where people are engaged only in those activities which they value intrinsically. Let us imagine, then, that all of the instrumental activities of human beings have been eliminated. All of the things ordinarily called work are now done by wholly automated machines which are activated solely by mental telepathy, so that not even a minimum staff is necessary for the housekeeping chores of society. Furthermore, there are so many goods being produced so abundantly that even the most acquisitive cravings of the Gettys and Onassis of society are instantly satisfied, and anyone who wishes may be a Getty or an Onassis. Economically, the condition of man is a South Sea island paradise where yachts, diamonds, racing cars, symphonic performances, mansions, and trips around the world are as easily plucked from the environment as breadfruit is in Tahiti. We have then eliminated the need for productive labor, for the administration of such labor, and for a system of financing and distributing such production. All of the economic problems of man have been solved forever. Are there any other problems? There are indeed. There are all of the interpersonal problems which do not depend upon economic scarcity. Let us, then, further imagine that all possible interpersonal problems have been solved by appropriate methods. Let us suppose that psychoanalysis has made such giant strides that it actually cures people, or that all the various kinds of group treatment have proven successful, or that some quite new development in socio or psychotherapy, or in pharmacology has made it possible to effect 100% cures for all psychic disturbances. As a result of these developments, there is no longer any competition for love, attention, approval, or admiration, just as there is no longer any strife in the acquisition of material goods. Perhaps a single example will serve to illustrate the state of affairs in question. Let us take the case of sex. Under present conditions, there is a short supply of willing sexual objects relative to demand, and it may be surmised that the reason for this is the prevalence of inhibitions in the seekers of such objects, in the objects themselves, or in both, so that great expenditures of instrumental effort are required in order to overcome them and thus get at the intrinsic object of desire. But with everyone enjoying superb mental health, the necessity for all this hard work is removed, and sexual partners are every bit as accessible as yachts and diamonds. Skepticus. But what about love, approval, attention, and admiration, Grasshopper? Even if it is not necessary to compete for these things in Utopia, people would still have to work to achieve them. On the contrary, Skepticus, many people seem to believe that the kind of love, attention, and admiration alone worth having is just the kind that one ought not to work at. Yes, but many other people, such as marriage counselors, take a quite different view. They are always saying things like, "You have to work at your marriage, you know." Yes, but what does this working at mean in the case of marriage, or, for that matter, in the case of any other intrinsically valued relationship between people? Does it not mean, essentially, being tolerant of and helpful with respect to one another's social and psychological shortcomings? But in Utopia, we are supposing that there are no such shortcomings to be tolerant of. Furthermore, whether it is or is not the case that in Utopia one will have to work at something in order to gain love and admiration, it cannot be love and admiration at which one works. We admire a person who works hard, let us say at teaching, but we admire him because he works hard at teaching, not because he works hard at being admired. I suggest that, for convenience, we lump together under the word approval all of the pro-attitudes we have been talking about, and then ask whether there is anything at all that our utopians could do to gain approval. Very well. First, then, it is clear that they cannot gain approval by their economic industry, since there is no need for such industry. And I take it that we must also rule out approval for governing well, since with no competing claims for goods requiring legislation and adjudication, there is no need for government. What seems to be left for approval is excellence in moral, artistic, and intellectual accomplishment. Do you agree? For our present purpose, at any rate, I think your list will do. Let us consider moral goodness first. Will you agree with me that moral action is possible only when it is morally desirable to prevent or to rectify some wrong or evil that is about to be or has been done to somebody? Yes, I agree with that. But we are also agreed, are we not, that in Utopia, no evil or wrong can befall anyone? Yes, that is true of Utopia by definition, since Utopia is just a dramatization of the ideal of existence, and evil and wrongdoing are obviously inconsistent with such an ideal. Well then, if no evil can befall anyone in Utopia, there will simply be no demand there for the performance of good deeds. They will, in fact, be quite impossible, and therefore not a means for gaining approval. Morality is relevant only to the extent that the ideal has not been realized, but there is no room at all for morality in the ideal itself, just as there is no room for revolution in the ideal which inspires revolutionary action. What about excellence in art? We certainly admire superior artistic creators, good critics, and accomplished connoisseurs. You will no doubt find what I am about to suggest very hard to accept, but it strikes me that there is no place in the ideal for any of the skills you have mentioned. I must admit, Grasshopper, that I find your suggestion positively staggering. How on earth do you arrive at such a strange conclusion? I believe that these skills would not exist in Utopia because art would not exist there. Art has a subject matter which consists in the actions and passions of men, with human aspirations and frustrations, hopes and fears, triumphs and tragedies, with flaws of character, moral dilemmas, joy and sorrow. But it would seem that none of these necessary ingredients of art could exist in Utopia. Perhaps a good deal of art would be impossible for the Utopians, but surely not all of it. There is, or at least there used to be, a school of aesthetics which regarded art as essentially consisting in pure forms, so that content was either adventitious and therefore dispensable, or preferably not present at all. Art, as shape or design or form, does not require the kind of subject matter you are talking about. My own belief is that form is not separable from content in the way you suggest, but if it were, then the creation of designs, whether in tones, shapes, colors, or words, could, and presumably would, be turned over to computers, since the products to be turned out would be, by hypothesis, uninspired by human emotion. Even if the utopians could not admire workers in the field of the arts, they could still admire accomplished thinkers, scientists, philosophers, and the like. Persons, that is, who are engaged in the acquisition of knowledge. Suppose we consider that possibility. Very well, let us do so. Now, by hypothesis, we are supposing that our utopians have completely eliminated the need for any instrumental activity whatsoever. But the acquisition of knowledge, just like the acquisition of anything else, is an instrumental process. That is, acquisition is instrumental to possession, no matter what it is that one is seeking to possess, food and shelter or knowledge. And just as we have supposed that our utopians have acquired all the economic goods they can use, we must assume they have acquired all the knowledge there is. In utopia, therefore, there are no scientists, philosophers, or any other intellectual investigators. Then it seems that there is nothing that one could do in utopia in order to gain approval. But we are talking about approval only to try to discover whether such things as love and friendship could exist in utopia. And human relationships, like love and friendship, include more than approval. Just as important, surely, is the sharing, which is generally recognized to be very prominent in love and friendship. And mutual interest in something does not imply a deficiency to be overcome on the part of those who have such an interest. True enough, Skepticus. But in utopia, what is there left to share? The sharing which admittedly plays a large part in love and friendship cannot be the sharing of love and friendship themselves. There must be something else, something like success and failure, adversity and prosperity, the enjoyment or creation of art, intellectual inquiry, respect for the moral qualities each possesses, etc. There is simply nothing of any importance in utopia to be shared, so that if love and friendship could exist in utopia, they would have to be kinds which contain neither approval nor shared interests. At most, therefore, extremely attenuated forms of love and friendship. Grasshopper, let me collect my wits. In utopia, man cannot labor, he cannot administer or govern. There is no art, no morality, no science, no love, no friendship. The only thing which our analysis has not utterly destroyed is sex. Perhaps the moral ideal of man is just a supreme orgasm? Prudence. Dear me. Of course, we mustn't forget game playing. That has not been ruled out. No doubt, no doubt. Are we then to conclude that the ideal of existence is sex and games, or, as we might say, fun and games? Actually, now that I think of it, I am no longer all that sure about sex. Oh, come on now, Grasshopper. No, Skepticus, I am quite serious. The obsessive popularity that sex has always enjoyed is, I suspect, inseparably bound up with man's non-utopian condition. Sex, as we have come to know and love it, is part and parcel with repression, guilt, naughtiness, domination and submission, liberation, rebellion, sadism and masochism, romance and theology. But none of these things has a place in utopia. Therefore, we ought at least to face the possibility that with the removal of all these constituents of sex as we value it, there will be little left but a pleasant sensation in the loins, or wherever. People like Norman Brown, in his book Life Against Death, take the view that sex is something which has been distorted and corrupted by the repressions and restraints of civilization, and that with the end of civilization, which Brown looks forward to with great keenness, sex will reemerge as the unsullied item that it was in our infancies. We will then all become happy children once again, enjoying without inhibition our polymorphous perversity. But if, as I believe, sex is the product rather than the victim of civilization, then when civilization goes, sex, at least as a very highly valued item, goes as well. In general, Skepticus, I find the current, or at least the recent, vogue enjoyed by the injunction to let it all hang out unwise in a fundamental respect. I have no quarrel with the act of letting it all hang out, for that, as when we undo a very tight belt or girdle, can produce a profound satisfaction. But once the act of permitting to hang out whatever it is we wish to hang out has been completed, and the attendant relief enjoyed, all we are left with, in the end, is just a lot of things hanging out. and in the absence of any new constraints upon them, they just continue to hang there, pendulous monuments to volitional entropy. If not convinced, I am, for the moment, silenced. Very well. Then we appear to be left with game playing as the only remaining candidate for utopian occupation, and therefore the only possible remaining constituent of the ideal of existence. And now I suppose you're going to rule out game playing as well, Grasshopper. I begin to suspect that what you are really up to is to show that the concept of utopia itself is paradoxical, as philosophers from time to time try to show that the alleged perfections of the deity entail paradoxes. Quite the contrary, Skepticus. I believe that utopia is intelligible, and I believe that the game playing is what makes utopia intelligible. What we have shown thus far is that there does not appear to be anything to do in utopia, precisely because in utopia all instrumental activities have been eliminated. There is nothing to strive for, precisely because everything has already been achieved. What we need, therefore, is some activity in which what is instrumental is inseparably combined with what is intrinsically valuable, and where the activity is not itself an instrument for some further end. Games meet this requirement perfectly, for in games we must have obstacles which we can strive to overcome just so that we can possess the activity as a whole, namely, playing the game. Game playing makes it possible to retain enough effort in utopia to make life worth living. What you're saying is that in utopia the only thing left to do would be to play games, so that game playing turns out to be the whole of the ideal of existence. So it would appear, at least at this stage of our investigation. I don't think so. I beg your pardon. I don't think that conclusion follows. You don't. I believe we made a mistake earlier on. A mistake? Yes, earlier on. Perhaps you would be good enough to point it out to me. I shall be happy to do so. When you were advancing the view that science or any kind of intellectual inquiry was an instrumental activity and thus could have no place in the moral ideal of man, I had some misgivings, and now I believe I know why. You know, Grasshopper, as well as I do, that people who are seriously engaged in the pursuit of knowledge value that pursuit at least as much as they do the knowledge which is its goal. Indeed, it is a commonplace that once a scientist or philosopher, after great effort, solves a major problem, he is very let down, and far from rejoicing in the possession of his solution or discovery, he cannot wait to be engaged once more in the quest. Success is something to shoot at, not to live with. And of course, now that I think of it, this is true not only of intellectual inquiry, but it certainly can be true of any instrumental activity whatever, and frequently is. We might call this state of affairs the Alexandrian condition of man, after Alexander the Great. When there are no more worlds to conquer, we are filled not with satisfaction, but with despair. How do you think we could have made such an elementary mistake, Skepticus? I think we failed to take note of the fact that an activity which is, from one point of view, instrumentally valuable can, from another point of view, be intrinsically valuable. Thus, we would agree that carpentry is an instrumental activity, that is, instrumental to the existence of houses. But to a person who enjoys building for its own sake, that otherwise instrumental activity has intrinsic value as well. And the same could be true of anyone who really enjoys his work, whatever that work might be. It seems to follow from this that we may now reinstate most of the activities we thought we were obliged to banish from utopia. The ideal, therefore, does not consist wholly in game playing. I believe you are correct, Skepticus, in pointing out that otherwise instrumental activities can be valued as ends in themselves. But I am not convinced that it follows from the fact that game playing is not the only possible utopian occupation. Let me see if I can persuade you of this. Let us continue to think of the moral ideal of man as an actual utopian community, then, but where, instead of supposing that all, so to speak, objectively instrumental activities have been banished, physical and intellectual labor and the like, which has been banished is simply all activity which is not valued intrinsically, thus leaving it open to any utopian to enjoy the exertions of productive endeavor. Thus, just as some utopians will be able to pluck yachts and diamonds off utopian trees, others will be able to pluck opportunities to fix the kitchen sink, to solve economic problems, to push forward the frontiers of scientific knowledge, and so on, with respect to anything a utopian might find intrinsically valuable. Yes, Grasshopper, that seems a much more satisfactory picture of utopia and the ideal of existence. Splendid. Now, to continue, it is clear, I should think, that the opportunity to work, or whatever other instrumental activity it might be which is desired, should not be left to chance in utopia. If at any given period of time everyone in utopia wanted to work at something, then such work should be available for them all. And if nobody wanted to work, then it would not follow, as it surely would in our present non-utopian existence, that society would collapse. And similarly, of course, with intellectual inquiry. That is to say, with respect to any objectively instrumental activity whatever, it would have to be the case that such activity could be undertaken, but it would also have to be the case that no such activity need be undertaken. For another way of saying that, the utopians only do those things which they value intrinsically is to say that they always do things because they want to, and never because they must. Yes, that seems correct. Very well. Now, let us consider two cases that would inevitably arise in utopia. Case 1. John Stryver has spent his first decade in utopia doing all the things that newcomers to utopia usually do. He has traveled round the world several times, loafed a good deal in the sun, and so on. And now, having become bored, he wants some activity to be engaged in. He therefore makes a request to the computer in charge, or to God, or whatever, saying that he wants to work at something, and he selects carpentry. Now, there is no demand for houses which John's carpentry will serve, because all the houses of whatever possible kind are already instantly available to the citizens of Utopia. What kind of house, then, should he build? Surely it would be the kind whose construction would give him the greatest satisfaction, and we may suggest that such satisfaction would require that building the house would provide enough of a challenge to make the task interesting, while not being so difficult that John would utterly botch the job. Now, what I would like to put to you, Skepticus, is that this activity is essentially no different from playing golf or any other game. Just as there is no need, aside from the game of golf, to get little balls into holes in the ground, so in Utopia there is no need, aside from the activity of carpentry, for the house which is the product of that carpentry. And just as a golfer could get balls into holes much more efficiently by dropping them in with his hand, so John could obtain a house simply by pressing a telepathic button. But it is clear that John is no more interested in simply having a house than the golfer is in having ball-filled holes. It is the bringing about of these results which is important to John and to the golfer rather than the results themselves. Both, that is to say, are involved in a voluntary attempt to overcome unnecessary obstacles. Both, that is to say, are playing games. This solution is interesting to note, was also open to Alexander the Great. Since he had run out of worlds to conquer by impetuously conquering the only world there was, he could have given it all back and started over again, just as one divides up the chess pieces equally after each game in order to be able to play another game. Had Alexander done that, his action would no doubt have been regarded by his contemporaries as somewhat frivolous, but from the utopian point of view, his failure to take such an obvious step would indicate that Alexander did not really place all that high a value on the activity of conquering worlds. Case 2. The early experience of William Seeker in Utopia is very similar to that of John Stryver. William, too, after a time wishes to be able to achieve something, but whereas John's abilities and interests had led him to choose a manual art, William is led to choose the pursuit of scientific truth. Now again, how much scientific inquiry is there to undertake at any given time cannot be left to chance, since the interests in doing scientific research might far exceed the amount of research that could logically be undertaken at any given time. It is even conceivable that there would come a time when all scientific investigation had come to an end. A time, that is, when everything knowable was in fact known. Since, therefore, there could be no guarantee that there would always be an objective opportunity to do scientific research, it follows that it would be undesirable to have utopian scientists stop doing research on a problem simply because the problem had already been solved. For what is important in utopia is not the objective state of scientific knowledge, but the attitude of the utopian scientist, which may be described in the following way. If the solution to the problem he is working on were readily retrievable from the memory banks of the computers, the utopian scientist would not retrieve the solution. This is just like the devotee of crossword puzzles who knows that the answers to the puzzle will be published next day. Still, he tries to solve the puzzle today, even though there is no urgency whatever in having the solution today rather than tomorrow. And just as the dedicated puzzle solver will say, "Don't tell me the answer, let me work it out for myself," William Seeker will have the same attitude towards his scientific investigations. Even if other means for coming to know the answer are readily available, he voluntarily rejects these means so that he will have something to do. But this again, I submit, is to play a game. What you seem to be saying is that a utopian could engage in all of the achieving activities that normally occupy people in the non-utopian world, but that the quality, so to speak, of such endeavors would be quite different. Yes, the difference in quality, as you put it, can be seen in the contrast in attitude of a lumberjack when he is, on the one hand, plying his trade of cutting down trees for the sawmill, and, on the other hand, when he is cutting down trees in competition with other lumberjacks at the annual woodcutters' picnic. Thus, all the things we now regard as trades, indeed, all instances of organized endeavor whatever, would, if they continued to exist in utopia, be sports. So that in addition to hockey, baseball, golf, tennis, and so on, there would also be the sports of business administration, jurisprudence, philosophy, production management, motor mechanics, ad for all practical purposes infinitum. So that the moral ideal of man does, after all, consist in game playing. I think not, Skepticus, for now that the utopians have something to do, both admiration and sharing are again possible, and so love and friendship as well. And with the introduction of the emotions associated with striving, the joy of victory, and the bitterness of defeat, emotional content is provided for art. And perhaps morality will also be present, possibly in the form of what we now call sportsmanship. So while game playing need not be the sole occupation of utopia, it is the essence, the without which not, of utopia. What I envisage is a culture quite different from our own in terms of its basis. Whereas our own culture is based on various kinds of scarcity, economic, moral, scientific, erotic, the culture of utopia will be based on plenitude. The notable institutions of utopia, accordingly, will not be economic, moral, scientific, and erotic instruments, as they are today, but institutions which foster sport and other games. But sports and games unthought of today. Sports and games that will require for their exploitation, that is, for their mastery and enjoyment, as much energy as is expended today in serving the institutions of scarcity. It behooves us, therefore, to begin the immense work of devising these wonderful games now, for if we solve all of our problems of scarcity very soon, we may very well find ourselves with nothing to do when utopia arrives. You mean we should begin to store up games, very much like food for winter, against the possibility of an endless and endlessly boring summer? You seem to be a kind of ant after all, Grasshopper, though, I must admit, a distinctly odd kind of ant. No, Skepticus, I am truly the grasshopper. That is, an adumbration of the ideal of existence, just as the games we play in our non-utopian lives are intimations of things to come. For even now it is games which give us something to do when there is nothing to do. We thus call games pastimes, and regard them as trifling fillers of the interstices in our lives. But they are much more important than that. They are clues to the future, and their serious cultivation now is perhaps our only salvation. That, if you like, is the metaphysics of leisure time. Still, Grasshopper, I find that I have a serious reservation about the utopia you have constructed. It sounds a grand sort of life for those who are very keen on games, but not everyone is keen on games. People like to be building houses or running large corporations or doing scientific research to some purpose, not just for the hell of it. The point is well taken, Skepticus. You are saying that Bobby Fischer and Phil Esposito and Howard Cosell might be very happy in paradise, but that John Stryver and William Seeger are likely to find quite futile their make-believe carpentry and their make-believe science. Precisely. Well, Grasshopper, what answer do you have to make to this objection? Grasshopper, are you dying again? No, Skepticus. What is it, then? You look quite pale. Skepticus, I have just had a vision. Good Lord. Shall I tell you about it? Skepticus glances furtively at his wristwatch. Yes, well, certainly, Grasshopper, please proceed. The vision was evidently triggered by your suggestion that not everyone likes to play games, and it was a vision of the downfall of Utopia, a vision of Paradise Lost. I saw time passing in Utopia, and I saw the strivers and the seekers coming to the conclusion that if their lives were merely games, then those lives were scarcely worth living. Thus motivated, they began to delude themselves into believing that houses made by people were more valuable than houses made by computers, and that long-solved scientific problems needed resolving. They then began to persuade others of the truth of these opinions, and even went so far as to represent the computers as the enemies of humanity. Finally, they enacted legislation proscribing their use. Then more time passed, and it seemed to everyone that the carpentry game and the science game were not games at all, but vitally necessary tasks which had to be performed in order for human survival. Thus, although all of the apparently productive activities of man were games, they were not believed to be games. Games were once again relegated to the role of mere pastimes, useful for bridging the gaps in our serious endeavors. And if it had been possible to convince these people that they were in fact playing games, they would have felt that their whole lives had been as nothing, a mere stage play or empty dream. Yes, Grasshopper, they would believe themselves to be nothing at all. And one can imagine them, out of chagrin and mortification, simply vanishing on the spot, as though they had never been. Quite so, Skepticus. As you are quick to see, my vision has solved the final mystery of my dream. The message of the dream now seems perfectly clear. The dream was saying to me, "Come now, Grasshopper, you know very well that most people will not want to spend their lives playing games. Life, for most people, will not be worth living if they cannot believe that they are doing something useful, whether it is providing for their families or formulating a theory of relativity." Yes, it seems a perfectly straightforward case of an anxiety dream. You were acting out in a disguised way certain hidden fears you had about your thesis concerning the ideal of existence. No doubt. But tell me, Skepticus, were my repressed fears about the fate of humankind, or were they about the cogency of my thesis? Clearly, they could not have been about both. For if my fears about the fate of humankind are justified, then I need not fear that my thesis is faulty, since it is that thesis which justifies those fears. And if my thesis is faulty, then I need not fear for humankind, since that fear stems from the cogency of my thesis. Then tell me which you have feared, Grasshopper. You alone are in a position to know. I wish there were time, Skepticus, but again I feel the chill of death. Goodbye. Not goodbye, Grasshopper. Au revoir.